The Full History of the Tulsa Race Massacre, 1921. A Deep Narrative Account. In the early 20th century, the United States was a nation still deeply divided along racial lines. Though slavery had officially ended decades earlier, the systems that replaced it, Jim Crow laws, segregation, and racial violence, continued to shape the everyday lives of Black Americans. Yet even within this harsh reality, there were places where Black communities not only survived, but thrived. One such place was Greenwood, a neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Its story and its tragic destruction would become one of the most devastating and long-suppressed chapters in American history. The Rise of Greenwood, Black Wall Street. Greenwood was not just another neighborhood. It was a symbol of Black excellence, independence, and economic success at a time when opportunities were heavily restricted. Founded in the early 1900s, Greenwood quickly developed into a prosperous district. Black entrepreneurs, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and business owners built a self-sustaining community. Because segregation laws prevented Black residents from shopping or doing business in white-owned establishments, money circulated within Greenwood. This led to the growth of a strong local economy. There were grocery stores, banks, hotels, restaurants, movie theaters, newspapers, and even a hospital. The community became so successful that it earned the nickname Black Wall Street. People came from across the country to see what was possible there. Greenwood was not just economically strong, it was culturally vibrant. Jazz music filled the air at night. Families gathered in well-built homes, and children attended schools that emphasized pride and education. But this success also drew resentment. The racial climate of the time. To understand what happened in Tulsa, one must understand the broader environment of the United States in the early 1900s. This was a period marked by intense racial hostility. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan were active and growing in influence. Lynchings and racial violence were not uncommon. World War I had recently ended, and many Black soldiers returned home expecting greater respect and rights after serving their country. Instead, they faced the same discrimination, and often worse. The year 1919 became known as the Red Summer because of the widespread racial violence that erupted across American cities. Tulsa was not immune to these tensions. While Greenwood thrived, many white residents viewed its success with jealousy and suspicion. Economic competition, combined with deeply rooted racism, created a volatile situation. The incident that sparked it all. The immediate trigger for the massacre occurred on May 30, 1921. A young Black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland entered an elevator in a building in downtown Tulsa. The elevator operator was a young white woman named Sarah Page. Something happened inside that elevator. Exactly what remains unclear to this day. Some believe Rowland may have tripped and accidentally grabbed Page to steady himself. Others think she may have been startled and screamed. Regardless of what truly happened, the incident was reported as an assault. The next day, a local newspaper published a sensational headline suggesting that Rowland had attacked Page. Rumors spread quickly, and tensions escalated. Gathering storm. On May 31, 1921, a crowd of white residents gathered outside the courthouse where Rowland was being held. They demanded that he be handed over, likely for lynching. Hearing about this, a group of Black men, many of them World War I veterans, went to the courthouse to offer their help in protecting Rowland. They were armed, as they feared what might happen if the mob gained control. Initially, the situation remained tense but controlled. The sheriff assured them that Rowland would be safe. The Black men left, but returned later as the white crowd grew larger and more aggressive. At some point during the confrontation, a white man attempted to...
The Tulsa Race Massacre,
Part 2, Deep Aftermath, Hidden Truths, and Generational Impact. The days after the flames. When the fires finally died down in early June of 1921, the Greenwood district no longer resembled the thriving community it had been just days before. What once stood as a powerful symbol of Black economic independence had been reduced to ashes, smoke, and silence. Survivors walked through streets that were no longer streets, just paths of debris and charred remains. Familiar landmarks were gone. Homes that once held generations of memories were now piles of burnt wood and broken bricks. The smell of smoke lingered in the air for days, mixing with grief, fear, and disbelief. But what made the situation even more devastating was not just the destruction, it was what came next. Mass arrests of the victims. In one of the most disturbing aspects of the aftermath, Black survivors were not treated as victims. Instead, many were treated as suspects. Thousands of Black residents were rounded up by authorities and taken to detention centers. These included convention halls, fairgrounds, and open spaces surrounded by guards. Some estimates suggest that over 6,000 Black individuals were detained. They were forced to carry identification tags, almost like prisoners of war, just to move freely within their own city. Armed guards monitored them. To be released, many had to be vouched for by white employers or citizens. Meanwhile, those who had participated in the destruction faced little to no consequences. The failure of justice. In the days and weeks that followed, there were calls for investigations. There were promises of justice, but those promises quickly faded. A grand jury was assembled to examine the events. However, instead of holding the white mobs accountable, the blame was largely shifted onto the Black community. The official narrative suggested that the violence had been provoked by Black residents themselves. No significant prosecutions were carried out against those who had burned homes, looted businesses, or killed innocent people. Justice, in this case, was not just denied, it was reversed. The economic betrayal. For the survivors, rebuilding their lives required financial support. Many had insurance policies that should have helped them recover their losses, but insurance companies refused to pay. They used clauses that excluded coverage for damages caused by riots. Since the event was labeled a riot rather than a massacre, claims were denied across the board. This decision crushed any immediate hope of rebuilding. Families who had lost everything received nothing. The economic damage extended far beyond 1921. Generational wealth, homes, businesses, savings was wiped out overnight. The long-term financial impact on Black families in Tulsa would be felt for decades. Attempts to erase Greenwood. Instead of helping rebuild Greenwood, city officials took steps that suggested a different agenda. There were proposals to rezone the area for industrial use. New building codes were introduced that made it extremely difficult for former residents to rebuild their homes. These codes required expensive materials and construction methods that many survivors simply could not afford. It seemed as though the city wanted to prevent Greenwood from ever rising again. However, the community resisted. Rebuilding through determination. Despite the lack of support and, in many cases, active resistance, Greenwood residents began to rebuild. Using whatever resources they had, people constructed temporary shelters. Slowly, businesses reopened. Churches were rebuilt. Schools resumed operations. This rebuilding effort was not funded by the government or insurance payouts. It was driven by sheer determination. By the late 1920s, Greenwood had regained some of its economic activity. While it never fully returned to its pre-1921 peak, it once again became a center of Black life in Tulsa. This resilience stands as one of the most powerful aspects of the story. The long silence. Perhaps one of the most shocking elements of the Tulsa Race Massacre is not just what happened, but how it was forgotten. For decades, the event was largely absent from public memory. It was not taught in schools. It was rarely mentioned in newspapers. Many officials. The Tulsa Race Massacre, Part 3. Hidden Power Structures, Cultural Memory, and the Fight for Justice. The power behind the silence. By the time the physical destruction of Greenwood had ended, another kind of force began to take control, one that was less visible but equally powerful. This force was not made of fire or weapons, but of influence, authority, and control over information. In Tulsa, like many American cities at the time, power was concentrated in the hands of a small group of individuals, business leaders, politicians, law enforcement officials, and newspaper publishers. These individuals had the ability to shape public narratives, influence investigations, and decide which stories were told and which were buried. After the massacre, this network of influence played a critical role in controlling how the event would be remembered. Instead of calling it a massacre, many official accounts referred to it as a riot. This single word shifted the meaning. A riot suggests chaos from both sides, while a massacre acknowledges one-sided violence. By choosing the word riot, those in power avoided responsibility. Language became a tool of erasure. The role of local government. City officials in Tulsa were not passive observers during or after the massacre. Evidence suggests that their actions, both direct and indirect, helped shape the outcome. Police officers not only failed to stop the violence, but in some cases actively participated in it. Members of law enforcement were reported to have deputized white citizens, effectively giving them authority to carry weapons and act in the name of the law. After the violence ended, city leaders focused less on justice and more on restoring order, an order that did not include accountability. Their priorities were clear: prevent further unrest, protect the city's reputation, avoid financial liability. Justice for the victims was not at the top of the list. Courts and legal barriers. For survivors seeking justice, the legal system offered little hope. Lawsuits were filed against the city and insurance companies. Survivors attempted to claim compensation for lost property, destroyed businesses, and personal injuries. But these efforts faced multiple obstacles. Courts dismissed cases on technical grounds. Insurance claims were denied under riot clauses. Legal fees were too high for many survivors. In effect, the legal system became another barrier rather than a path to justice. Over time, many survivors gave up their claims, not because they lacked evidence, but because the system was designed in a way that made success nearly impossible. Disappearance of evidence. One of the most troubling aspects of the Tulsa Race Massacre is the disappearance of key records. Newspaper articles from the time, especially those that may have incited violence, were removed from archives. Official documents went missing. Photographs and reports were lost or destroyed. This was not a simple accident. Historians believe that there were deliberate efforts to remove or hide evidence that could expose the full truth of what happened. Without records, it became easier to deny the scale of the violence. Without documentation, it became harder for future generations to understand the event. History was not just forgotten, it was altered. Oral histories, voices that survived. Even though written records were lost, the truth did not disappear completely. It lived on in the memories of survivors. For decades, these stories were passed down quietly within families. Grandparents told their grandchildren about the night the sky turned red with flames. Parents shared stories of fleeing their homes, of hiding, of loss. These oral histories became crucial sources of information. When researchers began to revisit the massacre in the late 20th century, they relied heavily on these personal accounts. Survivors described details that had never been recorded in official reports, details about violence, destruction, and survival. Their voices filled the gaps left by missing documents. Cultural impact and representation. As awareness of the Tulsa Race Massacre grew, it began to appear in literature, film, and art. Writers used storytelling to bring the event to life. Filmmakers created documentaries and fictional works inspired by the massacre. Artists used paintings and installations to express the emotional weight of the tragedy. These cultural representations played an important role in spreading awareness. They reached the Tulsa Race Massacre, Part 4, Hidden Economics, Lost Wealth, and the Long Shadow on Modern America. The wealth that vanished overnight. When Greenwood burned in 1921, the destruction was not limited to buildings. It erased wealth in a way that few events in American history ever have. Before the massacre, Greenwood was one of the most economically successful black communities in the United States. Money circulated within the community at an extraordinary rate. Black-owned banks issued loans, doctors treated patients, entrepreneurs ran thriving businesses, and families owned property that was steadily increasing in value. All of that disappeared in less than 24 hours. To understand the scale of loss, imagine generations of effort, savings, investments, land ownership, businesses wiped out instantly. Not damaged, not temporarily disrupted, completely erased. The estimated property loss at the time was around $1.5 to $2 million in 1921 dollars. Adjusted for today, that equals hundreds of millions of dollars. But even that number does not capture the full impact. The concept of generational wealth. Wealth is not just about what a person owns, it is about what they can pass down. Before the massacre, families in Greenwood were building generational wealth. Homes that could be inherited, businesses that could be expanded, savings that could fund education, land that could increase in value over time. All of that disappeared in less than 24 hours. Children who might have grown up in financially stable households instead grew up in poverty. Opportunities that should have existed, college education, business ownership, property investment, were suddenly out of reach. This is what makes the Tulsa Race Massacre different from many other historical events. It did not just affect one generation, it altered the economic trajectory of entire family lines. A lost economic model. Greenwood was more than a wealthy neighborhood, it was a model of economic independence. Because of segregation, black residents had no choice but to rely on each other. This created a system where black businesses served black customers, profits stayed within the community, economic growth was self-sustaining. This model proved that even under oppressive conditions, a community could thrive through cooperation and internal support. When Greenwood was destroyed, this model was also destroyed. It was not just a loss for Tulsa, it was a loss of a powerful example of economic possibility. Barriers to rebuilding wealth. Even after the physical rebuilding of Greenwood began, restoring its economic strength proved nearly impossible. Several barriers stood in the way. One, lack of capital. Without insurance payouts or government assistance, residents had no financial base to restart businesses. 2. Increased regulation. New building codes made construction more expensive, limiting who could rebuild. 3. Ongoing discrimination. Banks were less likely to issue loans to black residents, making investment difficult. 4. psychological impact. After experiencing such destruction, many were hesitant to invest heavily again, fearing it could all be taken away once more. These barriers ensured that even though Greenwood physically returned, its economic power never fully recovered, the highway that divided a community. Decades after the massacre, Greenwood faced another major disruption. In the mid-20th century, the U.S. government launched a nationwide highway construction program. While presented as a symbol of progress, these projects often had devastating effects on minority communities. In Tulsa, a highway was built directly through the Greenwood district. This construction destroyed homes and businesses, displaced residents, and divided the community into separate sections. The result was a second wave of damage, this time not by fire, but by infrastructure. Many historians view this as part of a broader pattern in which Black communities were disproportionately affected by urban development policies. Economic inequality today. The economic consequences of the Tulsa Race Massacre are still visible today. Studies of wealth distribution in the United States show significant gaps between Black and white households. While many factors contribute to this disparity, events like the destruction of Greenwood play a major role. The Tulsa Race Massacre, Part 5. Modern Justice, Political Struggles, Global Parallels, and the Unfinished Story. A century later, why Tulsa still matters. By the time the world reached the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre in 2021, the event had transformed from a hidden tragedy into a widely discussed chapter of history. What had once been buried in silence was now part of national and even global conversations. But recognition did not mean resolution. Instead, it opened deeper questions. What does justice look like after 100 years? Can historical wrongs ever truly be repaired? Who is responsible for fixing the past? Tulsa became more than history. It became a test of how modern society deals with historical injustice. The last living survivors. One of the most powerful elements of the modern Tulsa story is the voices of the last living survivors. As time passed, the number of people who had directly experienced the massacre became smaller. By the 21st century, only a few remained. These individuals carried memories from 1921 into the present day. As children, they had seen homes burning, families running, violence in the streets. As adults, they became witnesses, not just to history, but to the long silence that followed. When they began sharing their stories publicly, their testimonies had a profound impact. Hearing directly from survivors made the event feel immediate and real in a way that textbooks could not. Their voices became central to the push for justice. The fight in modern courts. In recent years, new legal efforts have been made to seek justice for the victims and their descendants. Unlike earlier attempts, these cases have taken a different approach. Instead of focusing only on property damage, they address broader issues such as unjust enrichment, the idea that others benefited from the destruction, ongoing harm caused by the massacre, and responsibility of local authorities. These legal battles are complex. Supporters argue that justice delayed should not mean justice denied. Opponents argue that too much time has passed and that legal responsibility is unclear. The courts have become a space where history, law, and morality intersect. Political reactions and divisions. The Tulsa Race Massacre has also become a political issue. Different groups and leaders have different views on how it should be addressed. Some advocate for full reparations, government accountability, policy changes to address inequality. Others emphasize historical recognition without financial compensation, moving forward rather than revisiting the past, broader economic programs instead of targeted reparations. These differences reflect larger debates within society about history, responsibility, and fairness. Tulsa is not just about the past, it is part of ongoing political conversations. The role of public memory. Memory is powerful. For decades, the absence of memory allowed the Tulsa Race Massacre to fade from public awareness. Now, the presence of memory is shaping how people understand history. Public memory takes many forms: museums and memorials, documentaries and books, school lessons, public discussions. Each of these contributes to a shared understanding. But memory is not neutral. It is influenced by choices: what to include, what to emphasize, and how to present it. The way Tulsa is remembered today will shape how it is understood in the future. Media, technology, and the digital age. In the modern era, technology has transformed how history is shared. The story of Tulsa is now accessible worldwide through online archives, social media, digital documentaries, and virtual tours of Greenwood. This accessibility has several effects: greater awareness. People from different countries and backgrounds can learn about Tulsa. Diverse perspectives. More voices can contribute to the conversation. Faster spread of information. Stories can reach millions within minutes. However, technology also brings challenges. Misinformation can spread quickly.
So now something has changed. Not in the village, not in the routine. Everything outside is still exactly the same, but inside, something has started to stay. Not a thought, not an emotion, more like a presence. Thomas woke up again. Same place, same light slowly entering the room, same silence. But this time, he didn't move immediately. He just lay there, eyes open, breathing steady, and there it was again, that quiet awareness. Not strong, not overwhelming, just there. Before, mornings would begin without being noticed. Now, the beginning of the day could be felt. Not as something new, but as something repeating. And that repetition didn't feel invisible anymore. After a while, he sat up, slowly, not thinking, just moving. He stepped outside. The air felt the same. The sky looked the same. But now, instead of just seeing it, he seemed to register it. Not deeply, just enough to notice that he was seeing it. And then, like always, he started walking. Same path, same ground, same direction. But this time, each step felt slightly more separate. Before, walking was just movement. Now, each step could almost be noticed individually, not in a mindful, peaceful way, just in a quiet, almost empty awareness. Step, step, step. No meaning attached, just repetition being seen. At the field, he picked up his tool again. Dig, lift, move, repeat. But now, between each action, there was a space, a very small space, where nothing happened. And in that space, there was that same quiet presence again, not asking anything, not saying anything, just existing. At one point, he stopped, not because he needed to, but because the movement didn't continue on its own for a moment. He stood still, holding the tool, looking at the ground, and then, for the first time, something almost became a full thought. Not clear, not complete, but closer than before. Something like, why this? But it didn't fully form. It didn't turn into a real question. It didn't continue. It just appeared halfway and then disappeared. And he went back to working, like always. Because even when something starts to form, habit is stronger. Back in the village, the same quiet changes continued in others too. People paused more, spoke less, looked longer at simple things. Not with curiosity, not with confusion, just looking. The woman by the water held a piece of cloth in her hand for a long time without moving, not thinking, not distracted, just still. Then suddenly she continued washing, like nothing happened. The blacksmith stopped in the middle of a strike, hammer raised, frozen for a second, then clang. He continued. No reaction, but the pause had been there, and somehow those pauses started to feel like the most real moments of the day. Not the work, not the movement, but the gaps between them. Even time itself felt different now. Before, it passed without being noticed. Now it
Imagine you're standing in a flat, dusty field in Mesopotamia about 6,000 years ago. There's no wind, there's just the sound of a small wooden shovel hitting wet river mud. Thwack, slap, thwack. Before we had the uniform red bricks you see in every wall today, people just grabbed mud. They didn't have a plan. They would scoop up a glob of clay, pat it into a rough oval, sort of like a heavy, wet loaf of bread, and just leave it there. They called these hand-formed bricks. Every single one was a different size. If you were building a wall, nothing fit. You'd put one lump down, then another lump that was slightly taller, and you'd spend the next 4 hours just shoving smaller pebbles into the gaps. It was slow, it was tedious, it was the beginning of a very long, very boring story. Eventually, someone, and we don't know who because their name was lost in the dust of time, got tired of the lumps. They made a frame, just 4 pieces of wood nailed together into a rectangle. This was the first mold. Now, imagine being the person assigned to fill that mold. You take the mud, you press it into the corners, you scrape the top flat with a straight piece of wood, then you lift the mold, you move 6 inches to the right, you do it again. You do this 10,000 times. The sun is hot, the mud is drying on your skin, and the only thing changing is the length of your shadow. The sun-dried era lasted for thousands of years. Think about that. For 3,000 years, the technology of the brick didn't change. People just waited for the sun to do the work. If it was cloudy, the construction stopped. Everyone just sat around looking at wet mud, waiting for the moisture to evaporate. The chemical process of evaporation